Great design is not a decoration. Design is not just about, the last 10% that you put on things to make things pretty. It's more about the first 90% that makes things work. In terms of product design, it's not just about like how your product looks. It's really about how your users experience your product and then how that translates to business results. So I think I would really encourage founders to invest in your founding designer, your founding design leader, and your entire design team, and then think implementing UX research early in the process as well, because all the insight and design work will sort of shape everything from your user trust to your growth model and your technical debt.
This is Designing Security Products, where we talk about the intersection of cybersecurity, research, and product design. And today I'm talking with Dannielle Dan, who is the head of design at an AI stealth company. So how you doing, Dannielle?
I'm good. How's it going?
Great. Yeah, it's going well. We're working with Dannielle on the stealth project, and so it's been great collaborating with her. And I asked her if she'd be interested in coming on and talking a little bit. She has a whole lot of experience and things to share, and she was nice enough to join me today. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat.
Yeah. Well, let's start. Tell me a little bit about kind of how you got into design.
Yeah, so it's a long story. I started my career at Microsoft from initially in the SQL data server department. I was the icon owner for a while. That was really fun. And then moved to the startup business group of Microsoft, where that's sort of my first-hand experience in designing for startups, although it was still under the Microsoft umbrella.
Mhm.
After that, I moved to Silicon Valley because that's kind of where all the startups are, and joined a few companies across different verticals, and eventually, joined the startup I'm at right now. And this would be my third AI startup. So it's been, a wild ride.
Yeah. So I'm sure it was super different working at Microsoft, a huge organization with lots of levels and teams and just lots of things that are going on. And then you said that you worked for a startup that was kind of inside of Microsoft. So I'm curious, how was that transition going from working for Microsoft proper, if you will, to a startup inside of a big organization? And then how did that vary from working in a startup that was not part of a multi-billion-dollar organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I miss the days when, we were at Microsoft and we didn't need to worry about, run rate or burn rate or, cash basically. So, so that's like a major difference because, working at an incubator startup business group at Microsoft, which by the way, no longer there as a business group, was really fun. Because our job back then was basically the same with like other startups, except you're under Microsoft umbrella. Versus here in Silicon Valley, in real startups, we do have to, worry about product market fit, how much runway we still have, how much design is making a real impact when it comes to go to market, product market fit, and then making a difference in users' usability and product experience. So so I would say not having to worry about runway is a major difference.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I'm sure that time at Microsoft and making the transitions, you've learned a method to research and design, and then I'm sure you've iterated on that a lot. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about, I say us, like there's other people other than me listening, hopefully there is, but a little bit about kind of your philosophy or kind of how you see the design process working.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say our design process it really depends on what problem we're solving, right? So in general, I would say like the double diamond process still fits everywhere else. And we go through a divergent and convergent process when it comes to, discovering, define, and develop and deliver. But then that cycle at startup is accelerated, especially after, these days all the AI tools are here. I feel like it's not just happening in design, but across the board, across all functions. We're being asked for more with existing resources. So there are, tools that we leverage and then basically to sort of accelerate the cycle. But then the design process remain very similar, which is, how do we discover the problem and how do we provide design solutions to solve the user's problems?
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of a constant, right? Regardless of what size organization, it's all balancing the objectives of the company. What are you trying to accomplish? And then users' needs, and then being able to do the thing that they're trying to do. So they actually want to use your product, right?
Mhm.
So you mentioned the double diamond, and I know a couple of weeks ago you said something in one of our meetings that hit me in a way I hadn't thought of before. So the double diamond is kind of this process of going wide and considering lots of things and kind of experimentation, and then you have this point where you're like, okay, now we need to narrow down and make a decision on which of those many possibilities, kind of narrow in on that, and so you go through this process of that. And I'd always heard it and thought about it in the context of as you're working on a product or as you're working on a feature set or anything like that. But I'd never thought about it at the meta level of an organization actually being in this process of the double diamond. And you mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, and it was just kind of like a light bulb went off in my head. I hadn't thought about that. You said, hey, we're in this side. Our organization, our company is here where we're deciding less experimentation, more implementing the things we've already created and the decisions we've already made. So is that something that you heard from somewhere else or anyway, tell me more about that.
Yeah, I feel like it all depends on the product development life cycle, right? So in the past, in bigger organizations or, Fortune 500 companies, there could be longer development cycles. I remember 15 years ago when I first entered the workforce as a UX designer, I vaguely remember in the Windows department where they were having like 2-year release cycles. But then these days, in startup, in the AI accelerated world, we are shipping weekly, if not bi-weekly. And then specifically in the AI startup we're currently at, we're getting ready for GA. So we want to sort of narrow down the scope and then march toward a concrete vision that everyone knows what to deliver and what that experience will be like. So yeah, so I think that is, part of the coaching that I sort of provide to the team to make sure we're on point in terms of the experience that we're deliver and then be sort of conscious of the timeline and resources of what we have while making sure that we know, we're delivering a experience user will be delighted about.
One of the things that we constantly have to juggle is thinking big picture, kind of strategic stuff, but then also tactical. And I think what you just mentioned, kind of figuring out what are the features that are going to be in this release that we have that's coming. So we constantly have to balance kind of the big picture strategic things and the smaller picture tactical items. So is there a framework that you've used for that or any advice that you have on kind of how to balance those two things?
Yeah, it's always hard. I think especially for startups because we have very limited resources. Ideally, I feel like bigger organizations may have more research resources for design leaders to focus more on strategic initiatives versus here we just need to do everything in terms of like we need to think about the technical things in addition to strategic things. And then we implement both for UX research as well as UX design. So for UX design, most of the days we focus on that technical delivery because we're very much about, making sure to provide clarity so that the team knows what to implement and then here's the vision for the short term and the long term. And then for the sort of 30% of time, I try to leave time to do strategic thinking and then sort of think the end-to-end holistic experience to make sure that we're, while delivering on the short-term experience, also march toward the right, user experience for the long term as well. And then we apply the same philosophy for research. There is, foundational studies that is being carried out in addition to, usability testing and, concept validating and so on. Yeah, so there's no luxuries in startup to sort of, oh, well, let's just all think about vision all day because we still need to deliver and help the team do product market fit, and then iterate on that vision. So it's sort of both at the same time.
Okay. And I think you said kind of 70% tactical and 30% strategic is kind of a rough thing there. I'm curious, how do you, and I know that's just a rough estimate, but how might we keep up with and track how much time, I guess not time, but I mean, yeah, I guess time really, right? So do you block out things on your calendar or do you have reminders to make sure you're doing that? Or you just kind of at the end of the week say, well, how did I do this last week? And do I want to make an adjustment moving forward? I'm curious kind of how you hold yourself accountable to that metric you want to hit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because we're in the B2B business. I've always been in the B2B business. So I personally find mapping to physical quarters is like at the end of each quarter, it's a good time for reflection when you're getting ready for sort of summarizing what your team has delivered in terms of, UX, research, content design, and even marketing design, and then looking into the roadmap next year, and then doing that a little bit of sort of long-term thinking. I personally find that sort of helpful for myself to do that reflection at the end of each quarter and looking into the new year. And then you can also do that at the yearly basis at the end of the year too, during vacation or sort of downtime. I do think, downtime is important for people to recharge and regenerate sort of ideas and for the business to go forward.
Yeah, you mentioned reflection kind of at the end of the year, and when we're recording this is in November, so we're definitely getting into that time of year where everyone is thinking about here are the things that we want to get done by the end of this year, and then here start thinking about the things that we want to accomplish in Q1 of the next year. So it's definitely it seems to be on my mind more once we get into the fourth quarter. I'm really thinking about that, and I'm sure
Yeah.
most people are that way, right? You just got this natural thing like, we've got to get this done by the end of the year, which seems super achievable in February. And in November, you're like, how are we going to fit it all in?
I know, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned it because this is especially true in the startup world because you can plan longer in like if you're a mid-market or large enterprise, your roadmap is still relevant by the end of year, looking back to like what you have set for like, January. But that's not necessarily true for a seed stage startup that is in the phase of, rapid product market fits. So yeah, so I think a best practice I personally have adopted is, we'll plan for a quarter, but we will plan not for longer for that because everything could be changing a quarter out. Yeah. I mean, even 3 months later, when you look at, when you look back on like, I was looking back on my first 100-day plan. I was lucky that I was able to sort of execute against all that and in addition delivered a lot of other things. But then I don't think that will be true for like roadmaps, especially for, for this market we're at. Like all the AI products are evolving daily or like every 7 hours. So yeah, so the landscape is changing and team just need to adapt.
Yeah, it's especially challenging, and I'm personally loving it. Working in the AI space, with a lot of the stuff, even in the other world that we're in, is kind of the security world, and so there are just established patterns in user interface, and most of the products are running in the web that we work on, right, in the browser, and so there's kind of established ways for things, the way things are done, right. But in AI, it's so early days that these patterns are being established right now. So it makes it challenging because there's lots of ways that you could accomplish this, but then at the same time it's exciting because you can figure out how to do something in a different way. It's like there's not a way that we always do it this way, right? You can explore and figure out how to do this without any preconceived notions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that you've had other organizations that you've worked for before this one, and I'm kind of curious. Do you have any war stories to share of like, here's the thing that was super interesting, or here's the thing that we really got right, or here's the thing that we really got wrong? I'd love to hear any of those stories.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One thing that came to mind was when I was working for Medallia. I was hired for the self-service initiative, and the company back then was struggling with um, sort of like for each of the large enterprise, things are very much customized because we're being too good of a customer, and then we just said yes to like all the customized requests of large enterprise because each business is very different. But the business was struggling with scalability, which was why the initiative was launched. And I was hired and then helped design and driven the design for 5 products under the self-service initiative. And then that turned out to be the right investment for the company
Mm.
because there is a path for scalability now. And then the company eventually went IPO. It was just a wild ride. And yeah, I think that investment turned out to be the right investment. With we also had a large design team. I was IC back then, and then
Okay.
having the right sort of investment in terms of like having a large design team focusing on making the product easier for the customers turned out to be a really good investment for the company.
Okay. And I'm curious when you said making it where it's really easy for the customer to use and kind of anytime you're moving from more of a white glove experience to a self-service experience, figuring that out can be challenging, right? So I'm curious, how much did user testing play a role in kind of your process that you had?
Yeah, I it's been so long. That UXR has always been a really important process, even if for the product we're working on right now, right? So we're a very small startup, but we're doing UX research,
Hmm.
and not only we're doing qualitative research, talking to users one on one, but we're also doing quantitative research in terms of understanding analytics. But then I would say like maybe in the startup phase, we put more focus on contextual inquiry because we want to understand the why instead of the what more. But then UX research is always really important in terms of it not only is sort of a validation for design, but it could also be a strategic driver for design as well.
Sure. Like here's a problem that we didn't even know about that
Mhm.
we should consider solving, right? And then like just the only way you find that out is from talking with customers, right?
Yeah.
And observing and seeing what they do. Yeah, it really is. I think it's a cheat code, honestly,
Mhm.
is working that into the process and finding out what are the problems that you need solved and are those things that our company should solve. Maybe they're not, right? Like customers have all kinds of problems. You're like, that's really interesting, but that's not where we need to focus. Otherwise, you end up getting distracted, like you were mentioning before, with kind of adding all these features for this big enterprise company because they're like, hey, we've got a check here that we'll write if you'll solve this problem for us.
Yeah, exactly. I think research is not just a checkbox before design, it's sort of the foundation of design.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think ideally every project should begin with the understanding of the user. I'm not saying like every project should begin with research because research is a luxury sometimes for startups. But then we need to make sure the measures of like the understanding of the user, the people we serve, and the product the system they operate with, and what shifts their behaviors. We need to have that level of understanding. And A lot of those are driven by UX research today.
What do you think is the most challenging part of doing research? Because there's a lot of teams that just don't do it. Right? You just said that startups see it as a luxury, and if you're very very early, then it can be challenging to do that. But what do you think is the most difficult thing about research?
Yeah. I think the difficult thing about research that is that it takes time to get good insights. At least for us, the recruiting part is the more difficult thing, but the rest are not difficult. But then I would also suggest sort of to in terms of selling the importance of UX research, design leaders always need to be conscious about how to translate those into concrete outcomes because stakeholders wanted to see how the insight drives business outcomes. So yeah, and then also one more thing that I would suggest is frame research as almost like a risk reduction and opportunity creation tool because we've got leaders that talk to potential buyers all the time. That's the go to market activities, and a lot of times we will get pushbacks from leaders in terms of we know what customers are asking for, but then I would sort of I would encourage the team to think through the lens of like, the C levels. Yes, they know what the business needs, but then at the end of the day, the people who gets the jobs done are the people that are at the ground level. And this is not a sort of like a accurate assumption to assume always the C level knows what the ground sort of the employees challenges, the pain points, especially when it comes to a large operation. And then, I mean, especially when it comes to a large enterprise. So that's where the disconnect is. And then that's where UX research can drive value because as product designers, a lot of times we're designing for people who are operating on the ground to help them operate more effectively, in addition to designing for the managers and the stakeholders. So, and then a lot of times in B2B sales process, the buyers would also, hear the feedback from the team. Do you feel like it's helpful in terms of the adoption of the tool? So that getting the user feedback right is really important for design teams for startups.
Sure. And for the design team to get the feedback from like you said, like the sales team that's actually talking to them, all too often I hear about them being kind of siloed information, right? Like the sales team is doing their thing and then the product design team is doing their thing. And they're both talking with customers, but they're maybe not sharing what they're learning with one another. Have you experienced that before? Is that something you've seen?
That's possible if the organization gets too large, and then information silo is normally like a challenge that I've seen. But in startups like ours, I personally don't feel like that's a problem because we're in sync when it comes to who's talking to whom. When that happens, I would encourage design leaders to set up regular one-on-ones with sales leaders and go-to-market leaders, marketing leaders, to make sure that you share those learnings, and also create meetings and opportunities in all hands or company-wide meetings to sort of share those learning in public as well. I think that has been effective ways for breaking silos for me personally.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. You'd mentioned when you were needing to sell the value of research to the leaders of the team. It made me think about something that Jared Spool said is that anytime they would do some research, or not anytime, but a lot of times they would talk with the team, whoever had hired them, and they figured out we want to do this research and see what users do. And then Jared's team would do the research, and then the leaders would say, well, yeah, that's kind of what we expected would happen. And Jared's like, I'm not sure that's true. So he ended up asking them beforehand, hey, we're about to do this research. What do you think we're going to find here? And kind of get them to go ahead and commit to, well, I think we're going to see that this and this and this. And then after they do the research, they say, hey, here's what we found. Then the leaders were like, I know that I said it was going to be these three things, but it turns out only one of those was right, and we found these other things over here. So I thought that was a really interesting way to make sure that they do see the value and not just say, well, we kind of expected that to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight, and thanks for sharing that. That reminds me of Heather, our awesome researcher, also shared another sort of tactic she have used before, which is almost like roadshows, but then asking the stakeholders beforehand, what type of questions do you have yet to answer about? We're about to kick off this research. Do you have any questions you have in terms of like you would like to get answers? And then she would, go around with stakeholders and collect those questions before kicking off the research, and then actually, report back with specific questions that they have in mind. Because too often, I'm sure you have experienced this, research ended up with being like a slide deck,
Mm-hmm.
Google Drive, where like, people have seen it once but they don't know how to apply it in their everyday lives or work. In terms of the approach that we take, we want to definitely translate those into specific design outcomes, and then also help people bridge the gap in terms of here's how you can leverage the persona, here's how you can leverage the findings here.
Sure. It helps draw them in, right? Like they have this question they'd like to know the answer to. And then we do some research and we're able to come back and say, hey, here's the answer that we heard from people to this question. So they're more bought into the process because they got to be a part of it and they got to contribute and they got to learn something from it too. So yeah, I like that. I like that.
Yeah,
That's great.
exactly. Yeah.
That's great. So I know you've gotten a chance to work in a couple of different companies, and I'm sure each of those organizations has a different philosophy for how to build a product roadmap, how to adjust it, how to implement that roadmap. I'm curious if you have any stories to tell about ways that's been done well, or maybe examples of what not to do.
Yeah, so it's a few thoughts come to mind because I've always been in B2B, and depending on your customer segmentations and industries, but what has been common is, you want to start collecting the customer asks. And a lot of times you would have, if you're lucky, customers asking for very similar things,
Mm.
especially when it comes to, you know, early startups, then you know what to build, right? But then there are also times where I've spent time at other companies with built things for one customer. Turned out like this is not a scalable feature, and no one else asks for that anymore. And then we learn something from it, like. But then, one thing, and I've worked with so much, wonderful PMs, and then my manager is a wonderful, product person as well. A very effective product approach that I've seen from just so many B2B PMs are that they would start like a table of some sort, right? Collecting feedback from all sorts of B2B customers, and then start giving them points in terms of like, urgency, scalability,
Mm.
industry, and start that process of identifying how scalable this feature would be if we build it. And then they would also have the exercise of like how much alignment this is with the founder's vision of the future, because that would be another consideration. And then the third consideration would be the market. We mentioned previously that with AI market, every 7 minutes there's a new tool popping up. So like, in consideration of the competitive landscape, and where your resource and sort of pros are in terms of market positionings, in combination to the founder's vision of where he or she or they would like to take the company to. So in the, considering all of those factors, and then we'll have the discussion of how, scalable a certain feature is, and then how much demand are we seeing from certain features. But I would say most of the time it's highly being dictated by customers. So especially when it comes to early startups, a lot of times companies would like to get that revenue. So I've seen the companies where like we'll do anything this customer says, no matter how specific the ask is. And then some companies would take more sort of due diligence of thinking, oh, we'll push back on this one because this is pretty much is going to be a not a feature that will be scalable. But yeah, so I think that exercise we need to do with product team, and product team will probably also do that exercise with sales team, go to market, and the leadership and so on.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's a balance between how far off course is this going to take us from our product vision, right? And then you have to balance that with how big a check and are they willing to write and how much runway will that give us? If we say yes to this, then will that give us more runway for us to do the things that we know are part of our long-term vision? And
Mhm.
it's always a challenge, and it depends on how hungry you are at the time, right? If you're at the kind of you just made some funding, then maybe you're a little more willing to kind of stay the course on what your vision for the product is. As you get further down the runway, let's say, you're like, well, maybe we should consider this. That's not a terrible idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know that in working with you, and then also the product person, I won't name any names, but the product person, and then also the founder, all of the interactions from the very first time we met with them, I knew that they really valued design and then also the research part of that and the look and feel and the customer experience. Very, very important to them compared to maybe some of the other companies I've worked with that they said, yeah, we know that's important, but I feel like this company we're working with is they really place it high. But what advice would you give to a startup founder who maybe doesn't really understand the value of nailing the user experience and the design and using research to do that? What advice would you give them to say, hey, you should consider this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I would give an advice that great design is not a decoration. Design is not just about the last 10% that you put on things to make things pretty. It's more about the first 90% that makes things work. And then in terms of product design, it's not just about like how your product looks. It's really about how your users experience your product and then how that translates to business results. So I think I would really encourage founders to invest in your founding designer, your founding design leader, and your entire design team. And then think implementing UX research early in the process as well, because all the insight and design work will sort of shape everything from your user trust to your growth model and your technical debt. Soon it will be sort of day and night difference very, very soon.
Okay. Awesome. That is fantastic advice. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, William.